The name Pelasgians was used by some ancient writers to refer to populations that were either the ancestors of the Greeks or preceded the Greeks in Greece, a hold-all term for any ancient, primitive and presumably indigenous people in the Greek world. In general, Pelasgian has come to mean more broadly all the indigenous inhabitants of the Aegean Sea region and the cultures before the advent of the Greeks. During the classical period, enclaves under that name survived in several locations of mainland Greece, Crete, and other regions of the Aegean. Populations identified as Pelasgian spoke a languages that at the time Greeks identified as barbaric, though some ancient writers nonetheless described the Pelasgians as Greeks. A tradition also survived that large parts of Greece had once been Pelasgian before being Hellenized. These parts generally fell within the territory which by the 5th century BC was inhabited by those speakers of ancient Greek who were identified as Ionians. Etymology. Much like all other aspects of the Pelasgians, their ethnonym is of extremely uncertain provenance and etymology. Michel Saccolari collects 15 different etymologies proposed for it by philologists and linguists during the last 200 years, though he admits that most are fanciful. An ancient etymology based on mere similarity of sounds linked Pelasgos to Pelagos and postulates that the Pelasgians were migrants like storks, possibly from Egypt, where they nest. Aristophanes deals effectively with this etymology in his comedy The Birds. One of the laws of the storks in the satirical Cloud Cuckoo Land, playing upon the Athenian belief that they were originally Pelasgians, is that grown-up storks must support the parents by migrating elsewhere and conducting warfare. Gilbert Murray summarizes the derivation from Pelasgi, current at his time. If Pelasgoi is connected with pi epsilon lambda alpha sigma, near, the word would mean neighbor and would denote the nearest strange people to the invading Greeks. Julius Pokorny derives Pelasgoi from *Pelagskoi, specifically inhabitants of the Thessalian plain. He details a previous derivation, which appears in English at least as early as William Gladstone's studies on Homer and the Homeric Age. If the Pelasgians were not Indo-Europeans, the name in this derivation must have been assigned by the Hellenes. The ancient Greek word for sea, pelagos, comes from the same root, *plak, as the Doric word plagos, side, appearing in *pelagskoi. Ernest Klein therefore simply interprets the same reconstructed form as the seamen, where the sea is the flat. Klein's interpretation does not require the Indo-Europeans to have had a word for sea, which living on the inland plains they are likely to have lacked. On encountering the sea they simply used the word for plain, the flat. The flatlanders also could acquire what must have been to the Hellenes a homonym, the seamen. Best of all, if the Egyptians of the Late Bronze Age encountered maritime marauders under this name they would have translated it as sea people. Ancient literary evidence. Literary analysis has been going on since classical Greece, when the writers of those times read previous works on the subject. No definitive answers were ever forthcoming by this method. Rather, it served to define the problems better. The method perhaps reached a peak in the Victorian era when new methods of systematic comparison began to be applied in philology. Typical of the era is the long and detailed study of William Ewart Gladstone, who among his many talents was a trained classicist. Until further ancient texts come to light, advances on the subject cannot be made. The most likely source of progress regarding the Pelasgians continues to be archaeology and related sciences. Poets. Homer. The Pelasgians first appear in the poems of Homer. Those who are stated to be Pelasgians in the Iliad are among the allies of Troy. In the section known as the Catalogue of Trojans, they are mentioned between mentions of the Hellespontine cities and the Thracians of southeastern Europe. Homer calls the town a district, Larissa, and characterizes it as fertile, and its inhabitants as celebrated for the spearsmanship. He records the chiefs as Ipithus and Peleus, sons of Lethus son of Teutmus, thus giving all of them names that were Greek or so thoroughly Hellenized that any foreign element has been effaced. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, affecting to be Cretan himself, instances Pelasgians among the tribes in the 90 cities of Crete, language mixing with language side by side. Last on his list, Homer distinguishes them from other ethnicities on the island: Cretans proper, Achaeans, Sidonians, Dorians, and noble Pelasgians. The Iliad also refers to Pelasgic Argos, which is most likely to be the plain of Thessaly, and to Pelasgic Zeus, living in and ruling over Dodona, which must be the oracular one in Epirus. However, neither passage mentions actual Pelasgians. Myrmidons, Hellenes, and Achaeans specifically inhabit Thessaly, and the Seloi are around Dodona. They all fought on the Greek side. According to the Iliad, Pelasgians were camping out on the shore together with the following tribes: towards the sea lie the Carians and the Paeonians, with curved bows, and the Leleges and Corcones, and the goodly Pelasgi. Hesiod. Later Greek writers offered little unanimity over which sites and regions were Pelasgian. One of the first was Hesiod. He calls the oracular Dodona, identified by reference to the oak, the seat of Pelasgians, clarifying Homer's Pelasgic Zeus. He mentions also that Pelasgus was the father of King Lycon of Arcadia. Osseous of Samos. Osseous of Samos describes Pelasgus as the first man born of the earth. Aeschylus. In Aeschylus's play The Suppliants, the Danaids fleeing from Egypt seek asylum from King Pelasgus of Argos, which he says is on the stream Orne, including Peribere in the north, the Thessalian Dodona and the slopes of the Pindus Mountains on the west, and the shores of the sea on the east, that is, a territory including but somewhat larger than classical Pelasgiotis. The southern boundary is not mentioned, however. Apus is said to have come to Argos from Naupactus, across, implying that Argos includes all of East Greece from the north of Thessaly to the Peloponnesian Argos, where the Danaids are probably to be conceived as having landed. He claims to rule the Pelasgians and to be the child of Palaechthon, whom the earth brought forth. The Danaids call the country the Apian Hills, and claim that it understands the Karbana or Dan, which many translate as barbarian speech, but Karba is in fact a non-Greek word. They claim to descend from ancestors in ancient Argos, even though they are of a dark race. Pelasgus admits that the land was once called Arpia, but compares them to the women of Libya and Egypt, and wants to know how they can be from Argos, on which they cite descent from Io. In a lost play by Aeschylus, Danaan women, he defines the original homeland of the Pelasgians as the region around Mycenae. Sophocles presents Anakis, in a fragment of a missing play entitled Anakis, as the elder in the lands of Argos, the Heron Hills, and among the Tisanoi Pelasgoi, an unusual hyphenated noun construction. Ticenians Pelasgians. Interpretation is open, even though translators typically make a decision, but Ticenians may well be the ethnonym Tirenoi. Euripides calls the inhabitants of Argos Pelasgians in his play entitled Orestes. In a lost play entitled Archelaus, he says that Danaus, on coming to reside in the city of Anakis, formulated a law whereby the Pelasgians were now to be called Danans. Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, describes the Greeks of the Trojan War as Pelasgians in his Metamorphoses. Sadly, his father, Priam, mourned for him, not knowing that young Aeschylus had assumed wings on his shoulders, and was yet alive. Then also Hector with his brothers made complete but unavailing sacrifice upon a tomb which bore his carved name. Paris was absent, but soon afterwards he brought into that land a ravished wife, Helen, the cause of a disastrous war, together with 1,000 ships, and all the great Pelasgian nation. Quote, Here, when a sacrifice had been prepared to Jove, according to the custom of the land, and when the ancient altar glowed with fire, the Greeks observed an azure-colored snake crawling up in a plane tree near the place where they had just begun the sacrifice. Among the highest branches was a nest, with twice 4 birds, and those the serpent seized together with the mother bird as she was fluttering round her loss, and every bird the serpent buried in his greedy maw. All stood amazed, but Calchas, who perceived the truth, exclaimed, "Rejoice, Pelasgian men, for we shall conquer. Troy will fall, although the toil of war must long continue." Of the 9 birds equal 9 long years of war. And while he prophesied, the serpent, coiled about the tree, was transformed to a stone, curled crooked as a snake. Historians, Herodotus of Miletus, in a fragment from Genealogy states that the Genos descending from Deucalion ruled Thessaly and that it was called Pelasgia from King Pelasgus. A second fragment says that Pelasgus was the son of Zeus and Niobe, and that his son Lycon founded a dynasty of kings of Arcadia. Acusilaus. A fragment from the writings of Acusilaus asserts that the Peloponnesians were called Pelasgians after Pelasgus, a son of Zeus and Niobe. Hellenicus of Lesbos, in fragment 7 of the Argolica, concerns himself with one word in one line of the Iliad, pasture land of horses, applied to Argos in the Peloponnesus. What is said about it is reported by different authors and all accounts differ. The explanation is trivial and mythical, but all accounts agree. Hellenicus said the term Argia or Argolis once applied to all Peloponnesus, and that Pelasgus and his 2 brothers received it as an inheritance from the father, named either Triopas, Eris or Feronius. Pelasgus built the citadel Larissa of Argos on the Erasmus River, whence the name Pelasgic Argos, but later resettled inland, built Parasia and named the region, caused it to be named Pelasgia, to be renamed Arcadia with the coming of the Greeks. According to fragment 76 of Hellenicus's Feronis, from Pelasgus and his wife many became a line of kings: Phrasta, Aminta, Teutonides and Nasses. The Pelasgians under Nasses rose up against the Hellenes and departed for Italy, where they first took Cortona and then founded Tyrrhenia. The conclusion is that Hellenicus believed the Pelasgians of Thessaly to have been the ancestors of the Etruscans. Herodotus in the Histories. The Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus wrote, with uncertainty, about the language of the Pelasgians. I am unable to state with certainty what language the Pelasgians spoke, but we could consider the speech of the Pelasgians who still exist in settlements above Tyrrhenia in the city of Creston, formerly neighbors to the Dorians who at that time lived in the land now called Thessalotis, also the Pelasgians who once lived with the Athenians, and then settled Placia and Skylake in the Hellespont, and along with those who lived with all the other communities and were once Pelasgian but changed the names. If one can judge by this evidence, the Pelasgians spoke a barbarian language, and so, if the Pelasgian language was spoken in all these places, the people of Attica, being originally Pelasgian, must have learned a new language when they became Hellenes. As a matter of fact, the people of Crestonia and Placia no longer speak the same language, which shows that they continue to use the dialect they brought with them when they migrated to those lands. Herodotus alludes to other districts where Pelasgian peoples lived on under changed names, Samothrace and the Pelasgian city of Antandris in the Troad probably provide instances of this. He mentions that there were Pelasgian populations on the islands of Lemnos and Imbros. Those of Lemnos he represents as being of Hellespontine Pelasgians who had been living in Athens but whom the Athenians resettled on Lemnos and then found it necessarily to reconquer. This expulsion of Pelasgians from Athens may reflect, according to the historian Robert Buck, a dim memory of forwarding of refugees, closely akin to the Athenians Athenians in speech and custom to the Ionian colonies. Herodotus also mentions the Cabiri, the gods of the Pelasgians, whose worship gives an idea of where the Pelasgians once were. Another claim made by Herodotus entails the Hellenes having separated from the Pelasgians, with the former surpassing the latter numerically. As for the Hellenes, it seems obvious to me that ever since they came into existence they have always used the same language. They were weak at first when they were separated from the Pelasgians, but they grew from a small group into a multitude, especially when many peoples, including other barbarians in great numbers, had joined them. Moreover, I do not think the Pelasgian, who remained barbarians, ever grew appreciably in number or power. He states that the Pelasgians of Athens were called Crani, and that the Pelasgian population among the Ionians of the Peloponnesus were the Aegean Pelasgians. Moreover, Herodotus mentions that the Aeolians, according to the Hellenes, were known anciently as Pelasgians. Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the Greek historian Thucydides wrote about the Pelasgians, stating that, before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, the country went by the names of the different tribes, in particular of the Pelasgian. It was not till Hellen and his sons grew strong in Thotis, and were invited as allies into the other cities, that one by one they gradually acquired from the connection the name of Hellenes, though a long time elapsed before that name could fasten itself upon all. He regards the Athenians as having lived in scattered independent settlements in Attica, but at some time after Theseus they changed residence to Athens, which was already populated. A plot of land below the Acropolis was called Pelasgian, and was regarded as cursed, but the Athenians settled there anyway. In connection with the campaign against Amphipolis, Thucydides mentions that several settlements on the promontory of Acte were home to, mixed barbarian races speaking the two languages. There is also a small Chalcidian element, but the greater number are Tyrrheno-Pelasgians once settled in Lemnos and Athens, and Bisaltians, Crestonians and Ionians, the towns all being small ones. Ephorus. The historian Ephorus, building on a fragment from Herodotus, attests to a tradition of an aboriginal Pelasgian people in Arcadia, developed a theory of the Pelasgians as a people living a military way of life, and that, in converting many peoples to the same mode of life, they imparted the name to all, meaning all of Hellas. They colonized Crete and extended the rule over Epirus, Thessaly, and by implication over wherever else the ancient authors said they were. Beginning with Homer, the Peloponnese was called Pelasgia. Dionysius of Halicarnassus. In the Roman antiquities, Dionysius of Halicarnassus in several pages gives a synoptic interpretation of the Pelasgians based on the sources available to him then, concluding that Pelasgians were Greek. Afterwards some of the Pelasgians who inhabited Thessaly, as it is now called, being obliged to leave the country, settled among the aborigines and jointly with them made war upon the Sicels. It is possible that the aborigines received them partly in the hope of gaining their assistance, but I believe it was chiefly on account of the kinship, for the Pelasgians, too, were a Greek nation originally from the Peloponnesus. He goes on to add that the nation wandered a great deal. They were originally natives of Achaean Argos, descended from Pelasgus, the son of Zeus and Niobe. They migrated from there to Haemonia, where they drove out the barbarian inhabitants, and divided the country into Thotis, Achaea, and Pelasgotis, named after Achaeus, Theus and Pelasgus, the sons of Larissa and Poseidon. Subsequently, about the 6th generation they were driven out by the Curites and Pelasgians, who are now called Aetolians and Locrians. For that the Pelasgians dispersed to Crete, the Cyclades, Histiotis, Boeotia, Phasia, Euboea, the coast along the Hellespont and the islands, especially Lesbos, which had been colonized by Mycas son of Crinicus. Most went to Dodona and eventually being driven from there to Italy, then called Saturnia, they landed at Spina at the mouth of the Po River. Still others crossed the Apennine Mountains to Umbria and being driven from there went to the country of the Aborigines. These consented to a treaty and settled them at Velia. They and the Aborigines took over Umbria but were dispossessed by the Tyrrhenians. The author continues to detail the tribulations of the Pelasgians and then goes on to the Tyrrhenians, whom he is careful to distinguish from the Pelasgians. Geographers. Pausanias in his description of Greece. Pausanias mentions the Arcadians who state that Pelasgus was the first inhabitant of the land. Upon becoming king, Pelasgus was responsible for inventing huts, sheepskin coats, and a diet consisting of acorns. Moreover, the land he ruled was named Pelasgia. When Arcas became king, Pelasgia was renamed Arcadia and its inhabitants were renamed Arcadians. Pausanias also mentions the Pelasgians as responsible for creating a wooden image of Orpheus in a sanctuary of Demeter at Theri, as well as expelling the Minians and Lacedaemonians from Lemnos. Strabo dedicates a section of his geography to the Pelasgians, relating both his own opinions and those of prior writers. Of his own opinions he says, "As for the Pelasgi, almost all agree, in the first place, that some ancient tribe of that name spread throughout the whole of Greece, and particularly among the Aeolians of Thessaly." He defines Pelasgi in Argos as being between the outlets of the Peneus River in Thermopylae as far as the mountainous country of Pindus, and states that it took its name from Pelasgi and rule. He includes also the tribes of Epirus as Pelasgians. Lesbos is named Pelasgian. Caere was settled by Pelasgians from Thessaly, who called it by its former name, Aegila. Pelasgians also settled around the mouth of the Tiber River in Italy at Pyrgi and a few other settlements under a king, Melios. Mythology. In 1955, Robert Graves in his mythography The Greek Myths claims that the Pelasgian creation myth involves a singular creatrix goddess who dominates man and predates other deities. The goddess gives birth to all things, fertilized not by any male opposite but by symbolic seeds in the form of the wind, beans, or insects. Language. In the absence of certain knowledge about the identity of the Pelasgians, various theories have been proposed. Some of the more prevalent theories supported by scholarship are presented below. Since Greek is classified as an Indo-European language, the major question of concern is whether Pelasgian was an Indo-European language. Pelasgian as pre-Indo-European. Unknown origin. One major theory utilizes the name Pelasgian to describe the inhabitants of the lands around the Aegean Sea before the arrival of Proto-Greek speakers, as well as traditionally identified enclaves of descendants that still existed in classical Greece. The theory derives from the original concepts of the philologist Paul Kretschmer, whose views prevailed throughout the first half of the 20th century and are still given some credibility today, though while Imowitz Moellendorff wrote them off as mythical. The results of archaeological excavations at Catalhoyuk by James Mellart and Fritz Schackjar led them to conclude that the Pelasgians had migrated from Asia Minor to the Aegean Basin in the 4th millennium BC. In this theory, a number of possible non-Indo-European linguistic and cultural features are attributed to the Pelasgians. Groups of apparently non-Indo-European loanwords in the Greek language borrowed in its prehistoric development. non-Greek and possibly non-Indo-European roots for many Greek toponyms in the region, containing the consonantal strings nth, or its equivalent nstt, e.g., in the peninsula of Attica, Mounts Hymettus and Brilessus, Lycurgus Hill, the deme of Gargetis, etc., or its equivalent ss, Larissa, Mount Parnassus, the river names Kephissos and Ilissos, the Cretan cities of Amnisos and Telassos, etc. These strings also appear in other non-Greek, presumably substratally inherited nouns such as Asaminthos, Apsanthos, Terebinthos, etc. Other place names with no apparent Indo-European etymology include Athenae, Mycenae, Messon, Kylene, Cyrene, Mytilene, etc. Also Thebes, Delphi, Lindos, Rhamnus, and others. Certain mythological stories are deities that seem to have no parallels in the mythologies of other Indo-European peoples. Non-Greek inscriptions throughout the Mediterranean, such as the Lemnostel. The historian George Grote summarizes the theory as follows: there are, indeed, various names affirmed to designate the anti-Hellenic inhabitants of many parts of Greece: the Pelasgi, the Leleges, the Curites, the Caucanes, the Aoantes, the Temaics, the Hyantes, the Telchines, the Boeotian Thracians, the Teleboi, the Ephiri, the Phlegai, and Ampsi. These are names belonging to legendary, not to historical Greece, extracted out of a variety of conflicting legends by the logographers and subsequent historians, who strung together out of them a supposed history of the past, at a time when the conditions of historical evidence were very little understood. That these names designated real nations may be true, but here our knowledge ends. The poet and mythologist Robert Graves asserts that certain elements of that mythology originate with the native Pelasgian people, drawing additional support for his conclusion from his interpretations of other ancient literature, Irish, Welsh, Greek, Biblical, Gnostic, and medieval writings. Ibero-Caucasian. Some Georgian scholars connect the Pelasgians with the Ibero-Caucasian peoples of the prehistoric Caucasus, known to the Greeks as Colchians and Iberians. Pelasgian as Indo-European, Anatolian. In western Anatolia, many toponyms with the ss infix derive from the adjectival suffix, also seen in cuneiform Luwian and some Palaic. The classic example is bronze age Tar-Huntasa, and later Parnassus may be related to the Hittite word parana or house. These elements have led to a second theory, that Pelasgian was to some degree an Anatolian language, or that it had aerial influences from Anatolian languages. Thracian. Vladimir I. Georgiev, a Bulgarian linguist, asserted that the Pelasgians were Indo-Europeans with an Indo-European etymology of Pelasgoi from Pelagos, sea as the sea people, the PRT of Egyptian inscriptions, and related them to the neighboring Thracians. He proposed a sound shift model from Indo-European to Pelasgian, Greek. Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, an English writer and intellectual, argued that the Pelasgians spoke Greek based on the fact that areas traditionally inhabited by the Pelasgi only spoke Greek, and the few surviving Pelasgian words and inscriptions betray Greek linguistic features despite its classical identification as a barbaric language. Albanian. In 1854, an Austrian diplomat and Albanian language specialist, Johann Georg von Hahn, identified the Pelasgian language with the Albanian. This theory has been rejected by modern scholars. Undiscovered Indo-European. Albert Joris van Windekens offered rules for an unattested hypothetical Indo-European Pelasgian language, selecting vocabulary for which there was no Greek etymology among the names of places, heroes, animals, plants, garments, artifacts, social organization. His 1952 essay Le Pelasgique was critically received.